So when we talk about performance enhancement, it really goes without saying that athletes need to be injury free to be at their peak performance. Well, unfortunately, as we know, injuries are part of the game for athletes, and they injuries do come in all shapes and sizes. From an ankle sprain to career-ending knee injuries. Surely there's got to be a way that we can prevent these injuries or reduce them from happening to keep them in that top physical condition. And as an athletic trainer, I was taught, and we, as young athletic trainers, our job was to prevent injuries. That was the majority of what athletic trainers did, was injury prevention. And yet we spent a lot of time, it seemed like, doing rehab and evaluating injuries and treatments. But then, that was the great part of the job I found personally, was the rehab side of things. But when you look at the job that athletic trainers do in terms of prevention, things like pre-participation physicals, proper hydration, environmental considerations, proper fitting of equipment, and of course, taping, bracing, all those things that we do really do eventually prevent injuries or reduce the incidence of them. Or so we think that they're prevented, right? But a lot of what we do is based on scientific research. And that's the cool thing about what we're doing in this series, is we're talking about the science behind a lot of how we can use research to make these decisions. But that kind of leads to the question, well, how do you prove prevention? How do you prove that you prevented something from happening that didn't really happen in the future? Can you really predict the future? Can you say you didn't prevent, or can you say that you prevented an ankle injury just because you taped someone's ankle? Well, you can't prove prevention. That's the thing. And it's kind of a logic and a philosophy thing here. You really can't prove something that didn't happen, but we can calculate the risk that's associated with injury, the factors that go into potentially increasing the incidence of these injuries. And then we can evaluate how effective we are at reducing the incidence of injuries, or the risk or the odds of getting hurt. So if there's a high risk of injury, we need to know what we need to be able to do to reduce that risk, and hopefully eventually will reduce the incidence. That's the goal of our prevention programs. So if one may say, if we actually reduce the injury rate, we may have prevented an injury. So in science, we like to use the term risk reduction rather than the term prevention. But I know that prevention is still one of the popular commercial buzzwords. And unfortunately, when we say injury risk reduction program, it doesn't sell as well as saying injury prevention, or even better, performance enhancement. But I can make the argument that an injury prevention program really is a performance enhancement program, because with the injury you can't perform. So in essence, we can call these types of programs, for whatever reason you need to, a performance enhancement program that focuses on reducing the risk of injury. So there are a lot of studies, a lot of programs out there that are evidence-based. Some aren't, but they are evidence-based, and they've been implemented and researched around the world. Lots of different types of injuries. Most of what we see tend to be more lower extremity, particularly in the ACL. We can't really show that we prevented an injury from happening with these programs, but we definitely can show that we decrease the odds or the risk of an injury. And so taking all the semantics away, we'll use the word prevention. You kind of know where I'm going with that. So I wanted to ask my friend, Dr. Tim Hewett, to come in and talk about his experience. He's probably the world's expert in ACL injury prevention programs. So we'll use that term again, but also in the programming that goes around with it. Done a ton of research, one of the most prolific researchers and published authors that are out there. And I'm just honored today to have you, Dr. Hewett. So thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Dr. Phil. I appreciate you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, the prevention term is never going to go away.
Yeah.
I call my algorithm Hewett's 5P. So what the 5P is it's personalized, preventive, and predictive performance programming. And so I do like the term preventive better than prevention, because it's more of qualitative, and it says that it has a capacity to reduce risk. So let's talk about risk reduction. And that is what we measure scientifically. We measure the relative risk, or the odds of an event happening and seeing at one point in time, and then post-intervention at another point in time, and we look at the odds or the relative risk of that injury happening pre and post-intervention. And what we've shown with many of our programs, especially our ACL prevention programs, Kate Webster from Melbourne, Australia, and I published this a couple years ago in Journal of Orthopedic Research. We did a meta of metas, which is very meta, obviously, and we've taken some heat on that. The term in Cochrane analysis, they call it actually an umbrella review. So it is actually a thing. You can do a meta-analysis of all the meta-analyses in the literature. And basically what we showed was, for all ACL injuries, you can reduce the risk reduction. And we discussed this in detail. If you're interested in the discussion section of that paper, you can reduce the risk by 50% for all ACL injuries, and by 2/3 for non-contact ACL injuries in females. So, and that's amazingly in musculoskeletal research and orthopedic sports medicine research, an effect size that large is almost unheard of. And this is real and true and valid. There's no doubt that you can reduce the risk of an ACL injury with properly designed neuromuscular training.
Yeah, I'm glad that you went straight into the science, as I love to talk about. And for those of us who may not know about meta-analyses and effect sizes, tell us a little bit about why what you just said is so impactful to the everyday athlete, to the everyday coach or clinician.
So let's go back to the days. I want to talk about my history a little bit, and where I come from. I'm a basic scientist. I was born to be a scientist. That and a rock star are all that I ever wanted to be, and it ended up I got to be both. So, and the thing about it is, I mean, it's the love of my life. I just love the scientific process. I love logical thinking. Getting on Twitter tends to drive me crazy and turn me into a bit of a Twitter troll, because illogical thinking, well, I just lose it.
Yeah.
So what we did, I came out of basic science research, cardiovascular research. I'm trained in cardiovascular biomechanics, in cardiovascular molecular biology, pharmacology. And I love that work. Very basic science, very cell and animal based, but athletics is always a part of my life. Just a plug where I'm from. I come from Cincinnati, Ohio. When I was in kindergarten, my Ohio State Buckeyes won the national championship. When I was in junior high school, my Cincinnati Reds won 2 back-to-back World Series. And I'm nuts for both of those teams and sports to this day. So very interested in sports, very interested in science. And, I told my 3rd grade teacher, I'm going to be a scientist. Mrs. Purvis. She was a great science teacher, by the way, an amazing science teacher. And by the time I was in high school, sophomore year, I told my uncle, I'm going to be a sports medicine scientist. And what he said was, he's a doc, he said, well, that means you need to be an orthopedic surgeon. I said, no. I said, I don't, have things like empathy and issues like that for patients. And he said, well, neither do orthopedic surgeons. But anyway, I said, I just want to be a sports medicine scientist. Okay, well, and I figured out my way. So what I did was I trained and I put as many scientific tools in my tool belt as I possibly could. And then after I did my second postdoctoral fellowship in basic sciences in cardiovascular biomechanics pharmacology, there were a couple scientists on my floor in the hospital at the medical school. And someone said, if you want to get into sports medicine, these guys, we didn't even know what they did. They basically were in a closet of a lab down the hall. And all we knew is they shipped cadavers in and out of there all the time. And it turned out to be Ed Groot and Dave Butler, who are two of the big people in cadaveric biomechanics and in sports medicine and orthopedics. So I went down and talked to them, and they said, well, the group we work with is Cincinnati Sports Medicine over on the other side of the university at Deaconess Hospital. Go talk to those guys. So I made the connection over there and said, hey, if you'll hire me, I'll write grants. I'll do anything I can to try to do some interesting work. Okay, so one of the studies that was going on when I started there, it was just finishing up, was a study that was led by Tom Lindenfeld. And the group I was with, we were covering north of the city and up in an area called Mason, Ohio, Soccer World. So let's talk about epidemiology a little bit. Mm-hmm. So the cool thing is we supplied all the physical therapists and athletic trainers to Soccer World. We did all the coverage. Well, what was cool, there were a few cool things about Soccer World. So the way they played then was they had half of the courts were natural grass and half the courts were the old AstroTurf, the hard plastic stuff. And so we had the impression at the time, our docs did, that AstroTurf was causing more ACL injuries than was natural grass. Mm-hmm. Well, we looked at that, and it was a massive amount of data. And now the cool thing was that there were leagues there, and our athletic trainers there were there all the time. And each team had the same number of players, and each team had to be co-ed in this league. So you had to have half males and half females playing in the league. And we knew that each game was exactly an hour. So we had all the data we needed, because in epi, it's relatively easy to get the numerator, the number of injuries there, but getting the denominator can be pretty challenging. How much exposure? Well, we knew exactly how much exposure they had. So when we collated the data and Tom looked at it, no difference between grass and natural turf at that time. And we can go down and talk more about what the new rubberized turfs look like. New rubberized turfs, actually, you have about a 65% increased risk, at least in the NFL, of having an ACL injury on the new rubberized turfs, those sticky rubberized turfs versus grass. Wow. But back then, the old plastic AstroTurfs found no difference. Then we started delving more deeply into the data, looking for something, right? Because, you have this huge study for a couple of years and you look at the data and there's nothing. Well, delved into the data, and what we saw was that women, and again, we had exactly half and half, so all the numbers were equal, were 6.2 times more likely to tear their ACL, regardless of whether it was on AstroTurf or grass, than men. Mm. And that was kind of mind-blowing. At the time, actually, people were not aware.
Right.
So what do you do then? You delve into the literature, right? What's out there? We couldn't find anything at the time. However, you keep looking, and we found in this kind of esoteric, unknown, the Journal of the Southern Orthopedic Association, the first author, this little known physical therapist named Terry Malone. Who's now a very good friend of mine, and we've lectured all over the world together for years and years. Well, we found 6.2. Well, what Terry did is he looked at the injury records of the Pac-10 and the Big Ten, and found that in basketball, women were 6.12 times more likely to tear their ACL than men. And he couldn't get that published anywhere at the time because no one believed it and it wasn't politically correct to report it. So, which again, let's not even get the mess we're currently in about the mixing up of politics and science. That's a bad thing. So anyway, problems there, but in the end of the day, what we showed and what Terry had already showed was women are, depending on the sport, they're somewhere between 2 and 10 times more likely to tear their ACL. That's where my training in powerlifting, athletic performance came in, and we started doing studies where we try to do interventions to see. So what we did first is we compared neuromuscular profiles between girls and boys and between men and women, and we actually looked across time longitudinally about what happens to boys and girls as they mature and the differences that lead to different levels of balance and power and neuromotor control. And so we started looking at all these issues, and what we found was basically a profile of women tend to be more quadriceps dominant, they tend to be more leg dominant, they tend to be more trunk dominant, meaning they move their body around and they let their trunk move more relative to their foot base. And so you can develop this profile of dominance patterns and look at what those differences are. And the good thing about these differences is that they're modifiable. Right. So what we started doing was designing interventions to make athletes less quad dominant and more posterior chain dominant, less leg dominant, more balanced side to side, less trunk dominant, and have overall better neuromotor control. And what we showed in that first series of studies was we could reduce the risk of non-contact ACL injuries. And this is several years of work, by the way, in multiple papers. So that first paper we published was in 1996 in AJSM, where we showed the change in neuromotor profiles and that we could alter those dominance patterns in high-risk girls and women. And then we published in 1999 AJSM that those programs in large cohorts, over 1,300 athletes, reduced the risk of non-contact ACL injuries in women by 2/3. Exactly what we showed in the meta-analyses about 20 years later.
Right.
So again, science sometimes a little too slow. But what we showed was, let's get back to this issue of prevention. Not crazy about the word, because I think as scientists, we need, and clinicians as well, I think we need to be very accurate and, as maybe even more important, very precise in our language. So it's very difficult to predict an event. You know, is this athlete going to have an injury? Well, we've had many years of debate over this, and many papers and many letters to the editor written on this issue. There's one group out there that says even attempting to predict is a total waste of time. In other words, screening is a waste of time. And the same group that says it's a waste of time for injury-free people says they can predict who's going to have a second ACL injury, which makes no sense to me whatsoever. However, it is very difficult to predict whether an athlete's going to have an injury and whether an athlete's going to have a specific type of injury. If you say, I can prevent that athlete from having that injury, that means you would have to be able to predict that injury.
Right.
That's not what we do.
Right.
We reduce the risk in the relative population. So, and we don't even attempt to predict anyway. What we're doing is we're creating a risk stratification profile for an athlete and saying this athlete has some risk factors, some dominance patterns that put them at greater risk. And what we do is we to personalize that, we look at their risk profiles and we develop personalized interventions that to reduce that risk in that athlete. Here's the other problem with this lack of accurate and precise language. When you tell an athlete, a coach, a parent that we're going to prevent their injury, you put yourself at increased liability. If you use the term, we're working to reduce their risk, then people understand that.
Right.
So, because it doesn't matter, I don't care how much intervention training you do, as we said, you can reduce risk by half to 2/3. Well, that means some kids are still going to tear their ACLs. I mean, that's just a fact.
Right.
So that's another word from a I hate to use the word legal because again, I don't like to introduce legality and politics into science, but you have higher risk of getting in trouble by using the word prevention.
So when we're talking about the prevention and the risk reduction, I think that's really important stuff to talk about. I love how you said the word preventive, and I've really gotten away from using that term of prevention and really looked at risk reduction. You also brought up the word epidemiology, which I'm sure a lot of us now after the pandemic have learned what epidemiology is all about. And I used to be very scared of epidemiology as I was a young clinician, and it became one of those things that intrigued me and made me want to learn more about it. And that's where I started really getting interested in the science behind prevention and risk reduction. And you had mentioned about the meta-analysis, which is obviously our highest level of evidence, and obviously an umbrella review would be even the highest level of evidence. You mentioned that you called it a mega. Is that right? No, meta
of metas.
Yeah, when I started looking at mine was a meta. I had never seen a meta-analysis of a meta-analysis, so I just called it a meta. And so now we know that it's an umbrella.
Yes.
An interesting thing you used also was effect size. And people think of effect size like a Cohen's D, the standardized mean difference. But what a lot of people don't know is things like risk reduction, odds reduction, those types of those are actually effect sizes as well. So are correlations, those types of things. And so when you mention the word effect size, that is a huge thing to know, is the level, like you said, is reducing that risk by that level, 50 to 65, I think 62%, I think is 2/3, 66% is huge in terms of that, and getting that out of that that umbrella. I'm going to say meta. I don't, umbrella is too many syllables for me.
Yes.
All right. So good stuff. And we talk about ACLs, and your history was with Cincinnati, and looking at, I think I found that amazing when you talk about the female risk. And you had said that you and Terry both found this 6 times risk in females, but then you said 2 to 10. I'm like, well, shoot, even 2 times is a big number, right? You're twice as likely to tear your ACL if you're a female. And now we know that the risk is there. So let's say you were talking about, you found these numbers. Okay, now we know that there's this risk. How do you then know what is contributing to that risk? You said you went back and looked at the literature. So now how do we go back and say, well, this is why that risk is so high?
So you do that, and I actually always take 2 approaches. Hypothesis driven research. So we had hypotheses. So for example, in that 1996 paper, one of our surgeons on the project, he was convinced that it was because females landed with straighter knees. That was his idea. Females land straighter, therefore that's why they tear their ACLs more. And when we started those studies, that was our working hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
And this brings up one of my favorite aspects to science is serendipity in science. And what I mean by that is you come with a certain idea and you follow that idea. Well, the problem with that is hypothesis generation and hypothesis testing is Francis Bacon's foundation of modern science. However, as soon as you generate a hypothesis in your mind, you have bias. You have introduced bias into your process. Now, there are ways scientifically that we can do everything we can to control for that bias, like randomized controlled trials. But when we started out, we said he thought this was because they landed with straight knees.
Right.
That's not what we saw at all. Female, and that fallacy goes on to this day, that females land with straighter knees than men, and they don't. And there's equal evidence that females land with less flexion as there is that they land with more flexion, and that they land with equal flexion. And if you look at all the data across the board, it's about the same. It's not flexion. What it is it's more in the frontal plane. They land with this dominance pattern that we call ligament dominance, which is collapse. It's not using the musculature to generate and control the forces, generate the muscular forces to control body movement. And what it leads to is massive amounts of hip abduction, knee abduction, and frontal plane collapse. Mm-hmm. And that was sort of the seminal finding of that 1996 paper. Now, believe it or not, 25 years ago, dating myself. So then we had data to work from, and then we had a whole profile. So we had this profile of ligament dominance, this inward collapse, then leg dominance, the difference between one leg versus the other. Everyone's leg dominant, but females at higher risk tended to be a lot more leg dominant. This one across the board, athletes who go on to ACL tears are definitely more quadriceps dominant. And what I mean by that is they don't turn on the posterior chain. They don't use their glutes, glute med, glute max, hammies. That all needs to be activated. And it's strength, and it's much more about power and muscular recruitment than it is straight strength. And then trunk dominance is crucial. So these four dominance patterns, and then what we did is around that, again, I come out of a powerlifting background, and in powerlifting, the way you generate power and control is plyometrics. And that's the way we started with this. A lot of double and single leg, hop to hold, retake off, teaching deceleration, teaching power, teaching force absorption. And that what we showed when we instituted these plyometric drills is that we could alter over 6-8 weeks, we could alter that neuromuscular profile. That was the neuromotor study. And then we took that out onto the field. We scaled it up into a large, we had several teams. Basically, we had athletic trainers out in all the schools in the area, and we got their programs involved in this intervention. And we showed we could reduce relative risk of injury by about 2/3. And from there, what that led into was that actually, when we did that, we hit the front page of the New York Times, believe it or not, on September 11th, 2001. You ever remember what happened on September 11th, 2001? We were I was on the front page of the New York Times. That's what people were reading in their New York City office buildings when the planes crashed.
Wow.
And so it became a phenomenon, actually, and kind of, well, it's been 20 more years now. It kind of took over my life. Again, I had no intention of being the ACL guy. We were just interested in this initial finding of Tom's, that women were at 6.2 times greater risk. And I tell you, I've faced over the last 25 years a lot of criticism when I presented that initially, that finding. One of the moderators who was supposed to grill me, she's a great person. She's a good friend of mine as well, also a Minnesotan. And she basically came to me before and said, I got a real problem with what you're doing, because you're saying women are at greater risk, and I'm very pro women, and I don't like saying that there's differences here, and I would tear you to shreds in this, moderating your session, except I think this work is so good. And I actually had her, be the keynote speaker of several of my ACL workshops over the years. And she's great. That's Liza Arndt at the University of Minnesota, and awesome. But the thing about it, I think what we were doing is actually empowering women, giving them the opportunity and the tools in their tool belts to not only reduce their relative risk of an ACL injury, but also make them much better athletes. And we showed across the board in the earliest studies, 6 to 8 weeks of this plyometric training we were doing, we could increase their vertical jump height about 10%. That's actually really good on a vertical jump. Vertical jump, by the way, counter movement vertical jump testing is one of the best measures of whole body power that you can measure. And it's also one of the most reliable and precise measurements you can take of an athlete, because it's extremely reliable and consistent measure. If you can increase that by 10% in 6 weeks, you're doing something really good. And we showed we could do that too. And that's where the coaches and the parents would come in, because we'd all also see, man, my whole, it's not just my kid, her whole team is playing better volleyball, better basketball. They're moving with more control, and they're jumping higher at the net or at the basket. So a lot of good. So again, going back to that 5P concept, you have to be personalized, preventive, predictive in your performance programming. And the key to this, and the cool part is, this really works. Mm-hmm. And it's like I said, going back, if you look at any intervention, so if you look at most surgical interventions, for example, the best you're going to get is just beyond error. So let's talk about error too. So error in musculoskeletal measurements is somewhere in the range of 10 to 20%. So I think you have to be aware of that. If you're taking a measure, I don't care whether it's on a dynamometer or whatever you're using to measure something in musculoskeletal medicine, whatever, a goniometer, anything, your error is going to, even if you're really reliable and you've tested out your reliability, when we measure that area, it's on average about 15 plus or minus 5%, 10 to 20%. So your effect, that means your effect size has to be greater than that for your effect to be real, right? So you have to have at least a 15, 20% effect of your intervention for it to be real. Otherwise, it's inside error. So it could be spurious. It could not be real. It could be due to error. So on most surgical, you are really lucky to do an intervention and see a 20% effect size. That's rare. 20, 25% effect size. That's an intervention that is going to change practice, right? A 20, 25% effect size. That's great, but it's relatively rare. Most often, interventions fall within error, things you're going to test. However, ACL injury prevention has an effect size between 50 and 67%. It's massive. Again, in orthopedics, sports medicine, musculoskeletal research, and clinical practice, that's unheard of. It's a massive effect, and it's real. What we do really works. The key, though, why haven't we gotten rid of, half to 2/3 of all ACL injuries? People don't institute it.
Right.
People don't stay consistent with it. People are not compliant with what the protocol is. There's lots of issues that still have to be worked out, but the basis of it is true and valid. It really works.
Yeah, I think that the plyometric component that you talked about is really important. As you mentioned, the ability to work on power deceleration. Those are the issues that we're having. And then emphasizing some things like I like how you use the word profile, which, correct me if I'm wrong, profile in a science, in more of a regression analysis, those are your factors of your regression, right? So you have 5 profiles or 5 factors. I think it was 5 you said, I'm not sure.
Yes, 5 factors.
The factors that contribute. And one of the things you said was quad dominance. I liked how you said, because there's this weird thing where we're always talking about quad. You got to get your quads back. And then at the same time, posterior chain. We got to have both. And a posterior chain is one of those that really has been neglected. And we got to not go down that quad path. We got to pull back, and we got to do some more of that posterior chain. So I'm glad that you found that.
The posterior chain is absolutely critical. I think you have to keep in mind your glute complex is the most massive. It's the largest, most powerful muscle in your body. And what is one of its primary functions is to position the head of the femur. Well, the head of the femur dictates where the knee joint sits. So that's absolutely crucial to activate that musculature. And for whatever reason, high risk ACL athletes, and especially high risk female athletes, under recruit their glutes. And that is a key aspect of strengthening, which is important, absolutely strengthening. But what plyometrics does, when you go into a lot of repeated jumping, increased flexion, forced acceleration, deceleration, you're forced to activate the glute complex in order to maximize that. And it helps athletes recruit that and then carry that out onto the field or onto the court.
Yeah. So let's we wind down a little bit and tell me, what's the deal with fatigue and ACL injuries? What's your thought on that?
So we're getting into my Twitter troll.
I know that you always have these comments about fatigue, so I just wanted to poke that bear a little bit.
Yeah, you got to poke. So there's this thing in both primary and secondary prevention of ACL. This is even written into 20 physical therapists go and do a consensus statement and say fatigue is an important aspect of preventing a secondary ACL injury. And I can't tell you how many times I've sat in a lecture and said, and heard people say, oh yeah, fatigue is the cause of this ACL injury. And years ago, I started looking at that and thinking, how do they know that? I don't even know where this idea came from. I have no idea. I don't know if someone was teaching it in PT school or AT school or I don't know, but people will say that and this is why science in clinical practice is so important. They will say fatigue causes an ACL injury. If you look at the data, there's no known association published that I know of that shows that fatigue causes ACL injuries. We started studying this, and what we did is with another meta-analysis of the literature. I did this, the lead on this was Tim Doyle, my buddy down in Sydney, Australia. And we looked across all sports, this was a massive meta-analysis. We found no association between the time in a game, the period in a game. Even if you looked at like the first quarter versus the last quarter of a game, if anything, the trend, it's usually not significant, sometimes is, but the trend is that ACL injuries happen toward the beginning of a game, not toward the end of the half or at the end of the game. And so then we did another series of studies we looked at in professional sports. We looked at all the professional sport videos we could find that had timestamps on them, and looked at all these videos together and found the same thing. If you look at when people tear their ACL, it's more toward the beginning of the half or the beginning of the game than it is when they would be supposedly fatigued. So this statement, and if you look at it, when your ACL tears is when you have the most force, which is related to velocity through Newton's laws. Acceleration, and force is mass times acceleration, and 1/2 mv squared. So you've got these associations between force and velocity. If you're fatigued, you're slowing down, you're creating less force. Force is what pops ACLs. So it's interesting. I think that's important that we all, in being accurate and precise, I think as clinicians and as scientists, you need to consider what is common knowledge. Now, again, if we're out on Twitter, or even when we ever get back to personalized meetings again, please don't stand up there and tell me fatigue causes ACL injuries without a bunch of references in your back pocket, which you won't have because they don't exist.
Yeah, and I was always saying, be careful of that word "cause," and be careful of that word "prove," and those types of things. Just don't go there.
No.
I know exactly what you're talking about, and I think that a lot of those myths come about from this inherent logic that they think that this is their hypothesis, but there's no proof, and it becomes this common knowledge because everyone keeps saying it. You know, ACLs and fatigue is not the only thing that happens, and there's tons of other things that fit into that, and that's why science is so important. The what you've talked about today is fantastic with research, and one of my goals of scientific literacy, and making sure that students and clinicians really follow the science and be able to recognize what's good and what's bad. Because just because it's published in the journal of so and so on Google machine, that you get a full text, that doesn't mean it's a good article. Even if it's a mega review umbrella of umbrellas, it doesn't mean it's a good article. And so we have to be very good. And I'm glad that you brought up all those great things that students learn in statistics or research methods, but it's really putting it into practice like you did for us today, which I really appreciate. And I know that our students and clinicians will really appreciate learning more about how we can bridge that gap between researchers and clinicians. And you're up there with, one of the top research professionals that really has that clinical side. And it's rare to have. It's kind of what I was talking to Todd Ellenbecker the other day. It's rare to have a clinician who's a researcher, and you're kind of the opposite of that. You're a researcher who has that clinical background. So I appreciate everything that you've done to contribute to the profession. and taught so much. Whether you did it directly or indirectly, you did a fantastic job. So thanks for being with us today, Tim. And I really wish you the best, my friend.
My pleasure. Appreciate you too, Phil.
All right. Take care.